ideal for the most peppy talk, but because we're talking about Savarkar, hopefully we'll make up with the substance of this talk for the lack of like energy in the air. Now we've got two biographers of Savarkar here. In a way, it's interesting that the last year, 2019, specifically the second half of last year, saw not one but two biographies of Savarkar come out. Vikram Sampath, who's in the center, his biography is a two-part biography. The first one is out, which broadly covers Savarkar's early life, and then he's just emerged out of prison when you end the narrative. Vaibhav Purandare's biography is a more complete one. In one volume, in a concise fashion, he gets you the full story, right till Savarkar's end. And both books are very interesting to read in their own right, and in very different ways even. Now, I won't really have very long-winded questions. Let's just begin with maybe Vaibhav, since he has the mic. Why Savarkar? I'll say, like, I know you lived in Maharashtra and you grew up there like I did, and I know for a fact that the Savarkar you hear about and you learn about in Maharashtra is not the villainous Savarkar you often get in Delhi, for example, because there's a completely different take on Savarkar. Was that the experience for you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. I'm sorry, can you hear me? Savarkar has always been considered a courageous freedom fighter in Maharashtra. Outside Maharashtra, he has always been an extremely controversial figure. For 2-3 reasons. Number one, because he is the chief theorist and propagandist of Hindutva, the philosophy that is being discussed so much in India today. And second is because of his alleged role in Mahatma Gandhi's assassination, which made him persona non grata for so many years in national politics. And for 30 to 40 years, there was absolutely no conversation on Savarkar happening in India. But in the late 1980s, from the mid 1980s onwards, conversation about him restarted because of the re-emergence of Hindutva on the political horizon. And it picked up as Hindutva became more and more prominent in public life. And what we have been hearing over the past several years are sharply polarized opinions on Savarkar. He's either a hero or he's a villain. He's either a freedom fighter or he's a traitor, for having written those mercy petitions or whatever, So I felt the need to address the issue directly. Is he a hero? Is he a villain? Is he a freedom fighter? Was he a collaborator with the British as he is alleged to have been? Did he have a role in Mahatma Gandhi's assassination? But I must mention a direct incident that made me write this biography of his. A national news magazine some years ago carried a piece about his mercy petition, saying that, with the writer of that piece saying that he had brought to light those mercy petitions, and Savarkar tried to hide those mercy petitions all his life. He never made them public. Now, I've been reading Savarkar in the original Marathi from my childhood. And
where you get a very different Savarkar.
Yes, it's a very different. And in his most famous book, Maji Janmatape, which is about his lifetime in the Andamans, he writes about these mercy petitions in detail. And I knew that. So I knew that this piece is, nobody has really unearthed these petitions, that Savarkar himself wrote about it. So I looked into this in greater detail, and I found out by looking into the archives that there were vigorous debates in the legislative councils during those days about Savarkar being forced to write those mercy petitions. In the late 1920s, in fact, Savarkar has a furious argument in the public domain with the editor of Pratap, Ganesh Shankar Vidyarthi, a prominent Hindi journalist and part of the Bhagat Singh group, about whether he should have written these mercy petitions at all. So if you look into the archives, there is a lot to look at, and you have people telling you that, I have brought this to light, Savarkar tried to hide it. No, he did not. He himself wrote about it in detail. He has in fact reproduced those mercy petitions in his books. And on the other hand, you have, on the one hand, you have critics of Savarkar saying he tried to hide these petitions. On the other hand, you have his followers saying in the Marathi papers and other dailies and periodicals and books that he never wrote those petitions. So neither of these things are true. are true. You know, if you just look into the archives, and this was my purpose, that, you know, let us bring out the truth about Savarkar.
And you know what's interesting is Savarkar was also a very consummate op-ed writer. Like Gandhiji, he also produced a volume of writing, sometimes saying contradictory things, but there's this huge paper trail. And it's interesting, you're also a journalist, and your book does bring a journalistic eye to it. Vikram,
I seldom find a figure of the past, particularly of the freedom struggle, who probably intrudes our modern contemporary discourse, political discourse, as much as Savarkar does. As we speak, I think yesterday there was some, and every time I keep getting a lot of missed calls from television channels. I know that someone's spoken something against Savarkar in the political arena, because that night's debate can be then shaped around it. You had the Seva Dal pamphlet that came up, a week or 10 days back. You had Sanjay Raut saying something yesterday. You had this whole clamor in the run-up to the Maharashtra elections, whether or not you need to give him a Bharat Ratna. And this, trend of either eulogizing and more so of calumnizing him has been, I think, on the rise ever since 2004, with the whole Manishankar Iyer episode, where the plaque in his honor in the Kala Pani, where he was incarcerated for 11 years, was removed. And ever since whenever a character of history is either maligned or forgotten, that's when they catch my interest. It was Gauhar Jan there, who was forgotten, and she immediately captured my interest. And here was a person who 60 years after his death still polarizes opinions so much, for and against. And as an academic, as a historian, when I looked back, saying what is the last document that has been written on him, a comprehensive biography, the last biography written on him was way back in the 1960s by this man called Dhananjay Keer. And it alarms me, this lack of inquisitiveness, lack of academic interest in a person who polarizes so much opinion. And the blame rests equally, I think, both on the proponents as well as the opponents, who cherry pick whatever aspect of Savarkar's life to their advantage and then present it that way. So there's this famous quote of Toni Morrison, who says that if there is a book that you want to read and it's not been written yet, you must be the one to write it. And so that's one reason I decided to pick up this very difficult subject, a man of multiple contradictions, a revolutionary in his youth, who was also a sensitive poet, a narrator, a dramatist, and also somebody who probably suffered some of the most inhuman tortures in the cellular jail in Andamans, forms India's first secret society of armed revolutionaries, which was called the Mitra Mela, which then becomes Abhinav Bharat, and which creates like a network of revolutionaries across India. And this aspect of Savarkar was not known to me while I set off, that he could also be a revolutionary kingpin of the movement, not only in India, but in the 5 years that he spent in London, in the India House, where these very, very fascinating characters of the time, Shyamji Krishna Varma, Madam Bhikaji Kama, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Madan Lal Dhingra, Lala Hardayal of the Gadar Party, MPT Acharya, VVS Iyer, Sukhsagar Dutt. Now these are all names which we don't even find a mention in our history textbooks. We were talking in the other session about history and how it's written. Our entire narrative of freedom struggle has been very, very, very simplistic, very linear, very monochromatic, that there was just a strain of non-violent struggle which got India her freedom. But I think right from the 1857 War of Independence, which is what actually Savarkar coined that phrase of first war of Indian independence, also wrote a book on it after 2 years of extensive research that he did in the British archives in London. From then on till 1946, the naval mutiny that you had in Bombay, which was led by INA and Subhash Chandra Bose, there's been a continuous and uninterrupted chain of armed struggle in different parts of India, and most of it was a lot coordinated, and that too at a time, you know, when there was no WhatsApp groups and so on, where people could actually coordinate and find those connections. So Abhinav Bharat, sitting way back in Maharashtra, was deeply coordinating with the Anushilan Samiti in Bengal, and the Alipur bomb case, in the Maniktola bomb case, where Barin Ghosh and Aurobindo Ghosh and others were convicted. The same bomb manual which Savarkar got smuggled from London is sent to Nashik to murder the British official there, and also in Bengal. So this caucus of revolutionaries that was operating across India, I think these other stories, these other narratives of what exactly was happening in those very eventful days of India's freedom struggle, I think that needs to be told. And 70 years after freedom, I think the time has come when we can look at this aspect of our past in a little more dispassionate, unemotional and objective fashion.
It's interesting that you say this, because even in other spheres, other scholars working on other topics really, there is an increased understanding of the revolutionary phase. Kim Wagner wrote a book on the Amritsar massacre, and he builds up, his entire build-up is about how the colonial state was always paranoid about revolutionaries and armed resistance. And in fact, this fear reached such a fever pitch really, that they ended up, Jallianwala Bagh was partly a response to that, because they just assumed they were imaginary enemies and that revolutionaries had some grand conspiracy and so on. But let's dial back from the revolutionary phase, where Savarkar's early childhood, his early years, his formative years, there's something to be said about a boy in his teens, etc., who starts rallying his friends around and creates what becomes a secret society and then goes on to become a large network. His community is interesting, because if you also study the sociology of the Chitpavan Brahmins, they were very much in power for a long time. They were the Peshwas of Pune. They were a very powerful community.
Yes.
And that fall from power, thanks to the British, following 1818, causes this real angst in the community, and you can almost sense as though a lot of that determination to stand up and fight back physically perhaps comes from that community's thing. So tell us a little bit about Savarkar's childhood, and then we'll come with Vikram to his early years when he's a revolutionary.
The community of that Savarkar belongs to is extremely important, the community of Chitpavan Brahmins, because they are in many ways the pioneers of India's political revolution. It is Mahadev Govind Ranade who forms the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, which before the Indian National Congress is actually the first broadly representative Indian national political organization. Of course, it is in the 1880s and later, it is soon overtaken by the Indian National Congress, but it is the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha that is the pioneer. Similarly, there are figures like Gopal Ganesh Agarkar, they are pioneers in the area of social reform. We hear about Ambedkar, Shahu, Phule, and these are extremely critical figures, of course. But there is a parallel strain of social reform, spearheaded by the likes of Agarkar, who died very young at the age of 38. But one of India's most fervent, aggressive rationalists. If you were to read what he wrote at that time, many Hindus and even Muslims and Christians would find all of it extremely uncomfortable today, just as they would find Savarkar's views on Hindu religion and ritual uncomfortable today. So that is in a way a legacy of that tradition of social reform. So when Savarkar says that there's nothing wrong in eating beef, that the cow is an inferior animal, and what's the problem? You can have beef. So there is this tradition of reform that he in a way represents. Then there is the tradition of Lokmanya Tilak, which is of again the patriotic national freedom movement. Tilak being one of the pioneers, exactly, the leader of the extremists in the Indian National Congress. Now Gokhale, the leader of the moderate, is also a Chitpavan Brahmin. You see, so this is the legacy that, and this is what Savarkar is reading all through his childhood. He's reading Agarkar, he's reading Tilak, he's reading Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and his opinions are being formed. His father is also a fervent nationalist, though he's careful because, he does not want to antagonize the British authorities. And when Savarkar writes a poem in praise of the Chafekar brothers who've killed a British official during the plague years, because they invaded Indian homes and molested people, etc., etc. The father is extremely careful, and he tells him not to get into this business, because the British might pick him up. What is important for us is to note is, regardless of the controversies around Savarkar, Savarkar is one of the pioneering Indian nationalists in the pre-Gandhi period. He spoke of Purna Swaraj, or complete independence for India, at least 20 years before the Indian National Congress did. The Indian National Congress resolution came in 1929. Savarkar had been speaking about it from the first decade of the 20th century. And as a leader of a group of patriotic and young Indians, as Sampath said, in London for 5 years, these are tumultuous 5 years, remarkable 5 years, where he has associates like Niranjan Pal, the son of Bipin Chandra Pal, and all the others. A very interesting example, since Vikram mentioned the role of revolutionary violence. Savarkar was advocating revolutionary violence in his speeches in London at India House, which the Scotland Yard and other British authorities were keeping a close eye on. And Mahatma Gandhi visits London in 1909. He is a leader of South Africans of Indians in South Africa, and together they address a gathering of Indians. And Gandhi keeps his speech short and says that I'd like to wind up quickly because all of you have come here to listen to Savarkar. So he has that kind of prominence among Indian nationalists of that period. But when Gandhi leaves London for South Africa on the ship, he's uncomfortable with the idea of revolutionary violence too at the same time. And he writes his book Hind Swaraj, which makes an argument against revolutionary violence. To which again Savarkar responds by saying that we are not interested in violence for the sake of violence. We commit violent acts because constitutional methods have been completely denied to us. So there is this remarkable debate also about violent methods of revolution and non-violent methods of revolution, which starts at that time between these guys.
The engagement of a young Savarkar with a relatively young Gandhi is actually a fascinating aspect which both of you touched upon. But Vikram, let's talk about his time in London. I mean, even before that, by the time he's come to study in Pune at Fergusson College, which is my alma mater, interestingly, he's already being tailed by intelligence officers. I mean, I had no idea when I was reading both your books that already by the age of 22, I think, there are actual intelligence officers attending this young boy's lectures in public, which meant he clearly had already earned a reputation, which is what he finally takes with him to London as well. Tell us about that phase and that segue into that London phase as well.
So this whole idea of being associated with the revolution, and usually when we talk of revolution, we'll locate it in a Marxist paradigm, whereas in the case of Savarkar, he was deeply influenced by the Italian revolutionaries, Mazzini, Garibaldi and others, and the young Italy.
Translate the biography.
Huh?
He
Yes,
also
yes.
translate.
So, and the young Italy that was formed by them, the parallels were very similar. In Italy too, there were all these princely states which came under Austria, and there were no arms that were there, so arms had to be smuggled, it had to be infiltrated. So the main philosophy of these secret organized societies that were formed, what was the philosophy on which they operated? So somehow smuggle arms from various quarters, learn the art of warfare, and infiltrate the British Indian Army. Now the entire edifice of the British Empire stood on the strength of the Indian Army, and that army was composed not of Britishers or Europeans but largely of Indians. Now if you could somehow appeal to their patriotic sentiments and say, after they are trained well enough in the art of warfare, to to defect and come over to the nationalistic side, then the theory was then the entire edifice of the empire on which the sun never sets would actually come crumbling down. And that philosophy and that strain, I think, carried on right till the naval mutiny too, which was what it was. How do you infiltrate the Indian Navy and have an uprising there? And the same seeds of that were there even in 1857. So this Mitra Mela, which then becomes Abhinav Bharat, within a few years it has tentacles across Maharashtra and, as I said, linkages with revolutionaries across India. He becomes the first student in Fergusson College to also conduct a bonfire of foreign goods when the partition of Bengal happens in 1905, for which he is even rusticated from college. He then gets a scholarship to go and study in London by this man called Shyamji Krishnavarma, who's giving scholarships to Indian students. First of all, of course, to go and study, but those who have a nationalistic outlook, who would actually help the cause of revolution and freedom struggle sitting in Europe.
And now you Tilak writes his letter.
Tilak actually gives a recommendation letter to Savarkar and he wins this scholarship. Now, one must understand that within the first 2 decades of the 20th century, a lot of the action of Indian freedom struggle was happening outside India, particularly in Europe, because there the sedition laws were not as strong as they were in India. And so a lot of anti-government propaganda could easily be conducted in France, in Germany. Germany was, of course, being a big rival of Britain, would openly support any attempts to subvert the British Empire. So all these fascinating characters are sitting there in London, in India House, where Savarkar is literally the leader of the pack. And then 2 things that he does. One is also providing an intellectual corpus to the whole idea of what revolution means. Now, our history textbooks again show revolution and revolutionaries as, these stray incidents, some young men who are hot-blooded, they just threw a bomb here and there, killed somebody, there was no strategy, there was no thinking, and then they would be rounded up and executed. But the whole idea of philosophizing of what a revolution actually is, that is what this man does, sitting in London. The book that I mentioned, the 1857 war, and also the translation of Joseph Mazzini's biography. And all these are actually smuggled and brought back to India in a very fascinating way. You had these double barrel boxes, and the bottom of that, all these books and manuscripts would be hidden along with Browning pistols, bomb manuals and all of that, and the top there would be something else, and it would be wrapped up as Christmas presents and the Don Quixote papers or something, and then circumventing surveillance, customs. Across continents, the manuscript and the books would come to...
The dust jackets of books were also changed, right?
Yes.
To make it look like fairy tales.
Fairy tale books and all that, but inside you have this explosive material. So the British actually were so scared of this man that they had termed him as a D category or a dangerous criminal. And they, in fact, none less than Churchill writes that we want this book that he's written on 1857 should not reach India, and they put a Sea Customs Act on it, and despite that this book comes. Incidentally, since we are in a literature festival, this book becomes the first book perhaps in the history of world literature which gets banned even before it is published. And this journey of how it gets published too is so fascinating. The manuscript is sent from London to Maharashtra to his elder brother Baba Rao in Sholapur. The spies are behind, the printing press is raided, then the manuscript goes back to London, from there it goes to Paris, there the Frenchmen are behind the manuscript, from there it goes to Germany. They think, they're the Devanagari script, the people know because of Indology. The book was in Marathi, but they make a mess of it, so it is withdrawn. Then it goes to Belgium and Holland, which is where the book finally gets published, and then it is translated to various Indian languages and brought back. And this book later serves also as a source of inspiration 20-30 years after it was published. The second edition of the book was published by none other than Bhagat Singh. And Bhagat Singh, in fact, I also mentioned in the book through an interview that I managed to access of a man, Durga Das Khanna, who was a congressman, who was a young revolutionary in his youth. And he says Bhagat Singh while recruiting people into the HSRA, would ask, have you read this particular book? So it almost became an entry criteria, a Bible, so to say, for revolutionaries. And 20 years later, you had Subhash Chandra Bose and Rash Bihari Bose getting copies of the book published in Japan, in Tamil, in so many other languages. So that was one aspect. The other, as I said, was also procuring bomb manuals, learning the art of manufacture. And the first flag of Indian independence is unfurled, is designed by Savarkar, and it is Madam Bhikaji Kama goes to the International Socialist Conference in Stuttgart in Germany in 1905, and much against British resistance, this is unfurled there, and she says, we don't care what you say, but we are a free nation from today. So as he mentioned, I mean, the whole call for complete independence came long back. Now all this naturally put him under the radar. Very oppressive Fugitive and Offenders Act is slapped on him, and the British wanted him back to India and tried there, because that in London this was not a big crime, you could get away. So the trial had to happen in India, so he's extradited here. On the way, of course, he jumps from the ship at this port of Marseille in France, and that becomes a court of, it goes to the International Court of Arbitration at Hague, just like the Jadhav case that is happening between India and Pakistan. Britain somehow managed to arm twist France, get this man, send him back to India. He's not given appeal, he's not given a jury, and the most harsh punishment of 2 life imprisonments, amounting to 50 long years, to a young man who's about 27, 28 then, is slapped on him, and he's sent away to the dungeons of Kalapani in cellular jail in Andaman.
We'll get
and
to
that's,
the Kalapani.
That's the end of Savarkar, the revolutionary, so to say.
Which is why it was a revelation reading both your books, because that whole revolutionary phase is never understood in so much detail, because it had, I mean, on the face of it, it's just remarkable. Partly also because look at his, when he published his 1857 book, it was also, as someone as senior as the Viceroy saying that specifically mentioning this book is not to be permitted there. Who was one of its greatest critics, who gave it a glowing review? It was Jawaharlal Nehru who did it.
So, can I say something about it? If since Rahul Gandhi has been saying a lot of things about Savarkar, if he takes a look, a rather close look and not a superficial look at the history of his family, he might find certain interesting things. So a very young Jawaharlal Nehru is studying in London in the first decade of the 20th century, and his father Motilal has told him, don't get involved with these revolutionaries at India House. Okay, you better study. And he sticks to his studies. But obviously he is influenced by various things as a curious young man, and he chances upon this book, which is available in London because it's a free country, but not available in India because we are slaves. So he reads this book and he writes to his father saying that this is a remarkable book, and this is the first Indian version of the 1857 revolt. And it is beautifully written, and Savarkar interestingly has used British sources to make the Indian case for freedom. So Nehru is also, he also analyzes the book. He says that, oh, his style of writing is a little flowery, but the content is solid. It just underlines the significance of Savarkar's work in the first phase of his life, when he was looked at as a heroic revolutionary. And if Rahul Gandhi were to indeed start reading some stuff, which is part of his family's archives, he may find such stuff. So it's in my book as well.
We've reached that part of the discussion where we start naming politicians. So the next bit is going to be even more fun. So the prison phase is fascinating, because when I reviewed Vikram's book, I did write in that if Savarkar was actually sentenced to death and he had died in 1911 instead of being put away in prison, perhaps we would have celebrated him as Bhagat Singh, because if you look at his revolutionary credentials, at that phase he's, pretty much up there. Even when he's in prison, there are these remarkable things you guys reveal about how Gandhiji was writing op-eds in his favor, saying free the Savarkar brothers and so on, perhaps in a lukewarm fashion, but he was still more or less, with them in their suffering. Now, prison in both your books actually comes across again as this horrific experience, because neither Savarkar nor his brother are treated as political prisoners. They are treated as regular prisoners sentenced to hard labor in chains. I'd like both of you to sort of tell us not only about the physical experiences of prison, because I remember one statistics, I forget which book I read it in, but there's this one statistic about the drop in weight. This 27-year-old man who goes in at 63 kilos or something gets reduced to 42, 43 kilos, and that itself tells you that prison was not a space where he's sitting and reading books.
I think the most basic of human facilities, denied to not only Savarkar, but there were almost about 100 political prisoners.
And other accounts corroborate this.
Yes, other accounts of Barin Ghosh, Ulaskar Dutt and others from Bengal who were housed there. The basic human facilities, of food, of toilet, of hospital facilities were denied to these people. And it's so sad once again that we as a country don't have all this as part of our history training. The food that used to be served was largely uncooked, or it would have pieces of reptiles and snakes in it, and eating that, most of the prisoners would end up with diarrhea. Now, the prison rules was that you had only fixed timings to even go to the toilet, and if you are running diarrhea, what do? You need to visit often, and when that was denied, most of the prisoners would actually defecate in their cells, and you had to sit and sleep and eat everything in amidst that squalor. You were not even allowed pen and paper, and even Savarkar and others with their nails, they would actually write on the walls of the prison cell, and he writes about 6,000 lines of verses of Marathi poetry, Kamala, Saptarshi and several other poems, and just to spite him, you had this hell of a jailer called Barry who comes and whitewashes all the walls in front of him. Little did he know that this man had such an elephantine memory that he had committed all these verses and would later come out and actually get that published, and these become important milestones in Marathi literature. Now, even if you fell sick, there was no medical treatment allowed, and in that heat of Port Blair, all through the day, the most terrible punishment was this kolhu, the oil grinding mill, where usually you have a bullock yoked to it, but the prisoner would be yoked to that, and all day you had to go round and round and extract oil. 30 pounds of oil to be extracted at the end of the day, and that would be measured, and if you are even 1 ounce less than that, you would be whiplashed, you would not be given dinner, you had to wear those gunny sack prison clothes which would lead to skin rashes and bleeding, and that also would not be allowed. And even Savarkar was given solitary confinement for almost 6 months, where his cell actually faced the gallows. So every day all you saw was screaming men who are being taken away to be hanged. And many people, either committed suicide or, went insane. In fact, there was an entire asylum that was opened up in this place called Haddo Island in Port Blair, just to accommodate all these political prisoners who would lose their sanity. So that was the kind of treatment which went on for many years, and circumventing all of that, through hunger strikes, non-cooperation, which all these prisoners lead, this man actually ushers in an era of reform in the jail, where a library comes up. There's also a lot of teaching of languages. He says, I'll teach you Marathi and Gujarati. Some Bengali would teach Bengali to the others. Everyone is among the prisoners. We start teaching each other's languages, so that creates a sense of national integration and unity. So 11 years that he spends there, I think these are very, very graphically detailed in his own account in his book Maji Janma Tape, or My Transportation for Life, and as you said, corroborated by all the other prisoners too who have written their memoirs.
The corroboration is interesting, is important. Vaibhav, this also takes a toll on his family life, in the sense that there's this sister-in-law who's raised him as a child since he was a very small boy.
Yeah.
She dies and he can't get a chance to see her. The way the wives suffer, the way all of that happens. Clearly his mind is also in great anguish, and that also comes across in his later recounting of that phase. So I would also like you to link it then to the mercy petitions thing, which is the first big controversy about him. And how, the mercy petitions seen in isolation perhaps give the idea that, he lacked courage. But when you sort of add up the context and see not only the physical difficulties of prison, but also the emotional difficulties.
I'd like to add a couple of things to what Vikram said right now. I think the conditions in cellular jail can only be described as medieval and abominable. These are medieval conditions. These are not 20th century conditions. And we talk about Guantanamo Bay today, but this was easily worse than that.
And in fact, the parallel is interesting. This was also an island far away.
It was an island, it was a penal colony, and full of disease and dirt, and So one thing is that one of the punishments that Savarkar was given during his stay in Andamans was standing fetters, which meant that his hands were tied to chain to the wall, and there's a chain here, and he has to stand like that all day long. And if he wants to go to the washroom or the bathroom, he's not allowed to. So a prisoner has to soil himself right in front of himself, and he has to stand in that filth all day, like that. Many prisoners, including Savarkar, underwent this kind of torture. Okay. There was something called crossbar fetters, where you have this iron triangle kind of thing, where your back hurts like anything. Again, you soil yourself all day. You cannot clean yourself. And it is the worst kind of humiliation. And Savarkar says that, when he does the choir pounding and the standing fetters and crossbar fetters, after that, when he lies down on the floor of the cell, he says every pore of the body just hurts. It is unbearable, the pain. So in fact, this is where, we need to understand the conditions that prevailed in that jail. When Rahul, again, unfortunately, I have nothing against Rahul Gandhi, but when Rahul Gandhi says that, Savarkar was writing mercy petitions to the British when Gandhi and Nehru was sleeping on the dirt floor of an Indian jail. See, we should consider ourselves lucky that Gandhi and Nehru and many others on the Indian mainland did not undergo the kind of torture that Savarkar and many other revolutionaries underwent in cellular jail. Because God forbid, you wouldn't even want your enemy to go through all that.
Even the mercy petitions, he wasn't the only one.
Absolutely. So, when it comes to the mercy petitions, now Savarkar's theory is very clear. Let's not die here, because we are in a remote colony somewhere outside the Indian mainland. If we die, people on the mainland won't get to firstly know about our deaths for years on end. So if they get to know about our deaths and the national movement is galvanized, it's a different matter. But that's not going to happen. We'll die futile deaths like mosquitoes. Let's not die here. Let's get out of here, go back and do whatever little work we can. And he tries to persuade other prisoners also to do that. And he himself writes those petitions. And he has written in his book about ferocious arguments he has with other prisoners who are opposed to writing mercy petitions, about how he tried to convince them that let's actually write these petitions, sign them and send them off. Now, as Vikram said, Barindra Kumar Ghosh, Aurobindo Ghosh's brother, also wrote similar petitions to get out of cellular jail. Before Savarkar even went to the Andamans, Satyendranath Bose, one of the Bengal revolutionaries in 1908, when Khudiram Bose and the others were involved in revolutionary acts, when he was set to be hanged, he wrote a mercy petition saying that, please let me out. In the 1920s, well after Savarkar has written his mercy petitions and the Kakori conspiracy unravels, Ram Prasad Bismil, Sachindranath, Sanyal, Ashfaqullah, they are all said to be hanged. They all write mercy petitions to the British. Fortunately, we do not call them traitors, because they are not traitors. Similarly, we may criticize Savarkar over various things. We may agree with him, we may disagree with him. I myself disagree with him on various issues. But to call him a traitor or a coward is unwarranted and absolutely puerile, in fact. It's childish to say
and
these things.
And it's not even a historical category.
Exactly.
It's a political category.
Yeah.
I'll just
Vikram,
add a little.
one quick thing though, Vikram. You can add on the mercy petitions, but I'd like you to then segue to the Hindutva, because the funny thing is somehow something changes in prison. The man who was singing praises of Hindu-Muslim unity in his revolutionary phase suffers a lot in prison, and then the pen that emerges outside prison is what creates Hindutva, which is why today Savarkar is reviled by many people. So just segue into that also.
Sure. So
running out of time.
Yes, sure.
Sorry.
So just to add on to this petition, as Vaibhav eloquently mentioned, it was a very normal route that was available to all prisoners, and in fact Savarkar, being this young barrister from London who was well versed in English, he knew the English law. So most of the other prisoners used to call him Bada Babu. He was like their leader. So if you actually look at his 1917 petition, he says something to this effect, not direct quote, but if my name constitutes an obstacle to the release of all the other prisoners, then delete my name and release the others, and that would give me as much pleasure as my own release would do. So clearly he was also being like the spokesperson or the leader for all the others. And when you see British records themselves, there are secret reports that while in prison, both Savarkar and his elder brother are actually also attempting bomb manufacture in Port Blair in the wilderness. And so the British are rattled, and they send this man called Reginald Craddock, who comes all the way from Delhi to interview these people. And Reginald Craddock in his official report says, I interviewed Savarkar, and he shows not an ounce of repentance or regret for whatever he has done. So the thing was not a mercy petition, I would call it a petition which was a normal agency that was available to everyone. And the idea is also, as a good lawyer, to argue the case. Am I a political prisoner or am I a common convict? If I'm a political prisoner, I need certain concessions like remission, like writing letters. You could meet your family only once in 1.5 years. Like Manu mentioned, his sister-in-law dies and you don't even know that she has died. You can't even write letters to your family. So all these concessions which are given to political prisoners across the world, that is something that these people argued for. Now, of course, if he was being hanged, would he have done that? That is a conjecture of history, no one knows. And as you also mentioned, in 1920, when his younger brother approaches Gandhi and says, both my brothers are rotting there for 10 years, please do something. Gandhi himself advises Savarkar to write a petition saying this, now you have the constitutional process, the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, so let them come into the mainstream, like how we do these days, rehabilitation of Naxals and all that, by bringing them into the mainstream. And in fact, Gandhi himself files a petition on their behalf. So if petitioning was such a bad word, then that would not have been the norm. So I think that context is very important.
But now let's talk about the Hindutva and very quickly,
yes.
because
so
prison experiences
yes,
and linking that.
My two things which I think influenced him to become to pen this very thin volume called Essentials of Hindutva in 1923, when he was actually in the Ratnagiri prison. One was, of course, the treatment that was meted out to prisoners by the jamadars in the cellular jail, who are largely Muslim, and very easily it was with that kind of tortures that they were inflicted, to convert them in lieu of lesser punishment was very easy. So they say you just without conversion, without conviction of faith, just by eating some prohibited food or whatever. So then that was so easy, but then getting back into the fold if they wanted was just not allowed. That was one experience which he writes about, which scarred his influence there. The other more important issue was, I think, the very dangerous program that was going on in India then, which was the Khilafat movement, which Gandhi had launched and yoked it to the non-cooperation movement, where we in India were actually sitting and mobilizing a group on communal basis. And probably for the first time, if religion entered politics in a very dangerous manner, it was a Khilafat movement, where, and also this, I would say, the seeds of partition were sown during that time, and separatism, where we were actually championing the cause of some caliph who was sitting thousands of kilometers away in Turkey, whereas the people of Turkey themselves did not want this man, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk took over that. Whereas Gandhi had actually promised the Indian people two things, that in 1 year you're going to get, we're going to establish the caliphate in Turkey, and in 1 year we're also going to give you Swaraj. Now both of these did not happen, because the whole program was based on illogic, because we were a slave nation. Now some people raising flags here, people are not going to re-establish. The British, who had won that kingdom, that country in war, are not obliged to accede to our request. So that program was doomed for failure. But the communal mobilization that happened led to a series of communal genocides across India, including Malabar, the Mopla revolt, and so on. And for all of that, the Gandhi and the Congress's response was always so pusillanimous. And so there was always a need felt for an intellectual counter to that. And that is how this whole Essentials of Hindutva comes about, where always he wrote in Marathi, but this was the first book he wrote in English, presumably for a pan-Indian readership, where the idea, he says right in the preface, that this Hindutva has nothing to do with the theological aspects of Hinduism, the religion, but it is more of a cultural and a nationalistic identity marker. So seen in that context, who is a Hindu in terms of a resident of this nation? He says anybody who is in between this landmass from the Indus to the oceans, who considers this land as the the land of their forefathers and also as their holy land, not in terms of religion, but in terms of allegiance, in terms of loyalty, that person is a Hindu. Again, you can be of any religion, so to say, but then this is more of a cultural and an identity marker. So that is how this whole idea of Hindutva comes about in prison and becomes what it becomes later.
Mutates into something else. Now, Weber, since you're the journalist, I'll throw the usual public domain question on the links of Hindutva and fascism, and where do you place Savarkar in that context? Because clearly, the books make it very clear the revolutionary was an interesting man.
Yeah.
Prison was not a cakewalk. It changed him for life. It changed his worldview. It changed his mentality. Everything.
Yeah.
It changed his physicality as well.
Yeah.
But then, where do you place Hindutva also in a time when fascism is emerging? There seems to be this admiration of that kind of method and that kind of sort of identity politics, as it were. You've got the Khilafat context.
Of course. Undoubtedly, the Hindutva movement in India in the 1920s and 1930s and even the 40s is influenced by these Western fascist movements. But it's not Savarkar so much who gets influenced, but others like Golwalkar and Hedgewar and B.S. Munje. So the paradox about Savarkar is that he, at one time, he praises Hitler's Germany for reviving German economy and for building this national community. This is, of course, before the horrors of Nazi Germany are known to the world. But in the 1940s, as the war begins, he actually pitches for supporting Britain in the war. He says that Indians should support Britain in the war and not Nazi Germany. So
this is when the Congress says they're going to just stand up.
Yeah, you just stand up.
And Savarkar disagrees with that.
So Savarkar is so full of contradictions that he keeps changing his opinions over and over again. In that sense, he is also different from Golwalkar or Hedgewar, because he is actually a thinker and a journalist and a writer and an intellectual. We may agree with him, we may disagree with him, but he keeps changing his views and he keeps evolving as an individual. Whereas Golwalkar is fixed, in his views never change, his ideology never changes, and Savarkar's views are in many ways different from the views of the RSS. So yes, there is some opinion he has expressed in favor of Italy and Germany, but that is at the time when the horrors are not known. And we must remember that at that time many Indians were speaking along similar lines. For instance, the socialists and Pandit Nehru also was praising Russia when the horrors of Stalin's regime were not known to the outside world. So one has to look at things in context.
All right, we won't push this too much because we've got only about 12 minutes for audience questions. If the audience has lots of political questions connected to Hindutva and religion and where Savarkar stands as an icon today, and the idea of pushing Savarkar, even placing his painting in Parliament was a big fuss back in the day, and for various reasons. So if you've got questions, feel free to ask all the loaded political questions. Now that we've got the chronology and the three phases.
ഞാൻ മലയാളത്തിൽ ചോദിക്കും, മണി ഒന്ന് ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് കൊടുക്കണം. ആക്ച്വലി ഈ സെഷൻ സവർക്കറെ വെള്ളപൂശാനുള്ള ഒരു സെഷനാണോ അതോ ഞങ്ങൾ ഇതുവരെ അറിഞ്ഞത് തെറ്റായ കഥകളായിരുന്നോ?
ഞാൻ ആദ്യം ഒരു ഉത്തരം പറയാം. അതാണ് ഞാൻ 3 കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റിൽ പറഞ്ഞത്. റെവല്യൂഷണറിയുടെ ഫേസിൽ ഒരുപാട് ഡോക്യുമെന്റ്സ് ഉണ്ട്. ഒരു ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയൻ ഒരു മോറൽ ജഡ്ജ്മെന്റ് അല്ല ഇതിനെ തിരിക്കുന്നത്. ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയൻ ചെയ്യുന്നത് ഡോക്യുമെന്റ്സിന്റെ തെളിവ് എന്താണ് പറഞ്ഞത്. അപ്പൊ റെവല്യൂഷണറി ഫേസ് 1. പ്രിസന്റെ ഫേസ് അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ പുസ്തകമുണ്ട്, വേറെ കുറെ സോഴ്സസ് ഉണ്ട്, ബ്രിട്ടീഷിലെ ആ prison records ഉണ്ട്. അതിന്റെ ബേസിസിലാണ് ജഡ്ജ്മെന്റ് വരുന്നത്. ഹിന്ദുത്വ ഇസ് വെയർ സാവർക്കർ ബിക്കംസ് കോംപ്ലിക്കേറ്റഡ്. അവിടെയാണ് ഈ താലിയടിക്കലുടെ ഒരു പ്രശ്നം വരുന്നത്. ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് ഡെഫിനറ്റ്ലി നമുക്കൊക്കെ അറിയാവുന്ന ഒരു പ്രശ്നം തന്നെയാണ്. പക്ഷെ വെൻ യു ആർ ലുക്കിംഗ് അറ്റ് ദ ക്രോണോളജി ഓഫ് എ പേഴ്സൺസ് ലൈഫ്, ആദ്യത്തെ ഫേസിലെ മനുഷ്യനല്ല മാത്രം പിന്നീട് ആ ഒരു ഫിലോസഫി ഉണ്ടാക്കിയത്. Now I'll translate for you. She was asking whether this session was to whitewash Savarkar or to really discuss his pros and cons or whatever.
I don't think there is a need to whitewash or eulogize. I think, as I said right at the beginning, even if you want to hate someone, please do that after reading about that person. If there is no book that is written about a person for 60 long years in a country where every year there is a book that is written on Gandhi and Nehru, and rightly so, doesn't it amaze you the lack of intellectual freedom or inquisitiveness? We hate an object so much, but then anybody who's associated with that becomes persona non grata. None less than someone like a Hridayanath Mangeshkar, the brother of Lata Mangeshkar, because these people were the ones who resurrected some of the poetry of Savarkar. He was also a great poet. Jayostute, that is that famous song, Sagara Pran Tadmalala, all these were put into tune, and actually he was in All India Radio. For doing that, Hridayanath Mangeshkar actually loses his job. So this level of the famous word today in India of intolerance, I think with intolerance, you cannot evaluate any kind of historical figure. So if you really want to hate the person, please do that by all means. But then putting these gatekeepers saying we are not even going to discuss this person because this is an untouchable, I think that is extremely problematic for a thinking society. In the West, people hate Hitler, people hate the Nazi party and what all the Holocaust horrors, but thousands and thousands of books are written about that, so that's how the mind, I think, germinates. Whereas in this country, we are sadly the kind where we make political untouchables of people, and so anybody who evaluates that is also tagged by all these labels saying, you are either whitewashing or you're eulogizing, with just stating facts. If there are counter facts to this, kindly produce that, and the answer to a good book should be another better book.
Sir.
No, I think our idea is to have a conversation on the subject. For 50 years, we just didn't have a conversation on Savarkar. Of course, you can criticize him, you can hate him, and there is no question of whitewashing him for the simple reason he's just too controversial a political figure. He cannot be whitewashed. He was controversial during his lifetime. He has been controversial, in contemporary India, and he will continue to be controversial because of his espousal of Hindutva, because of his arrest in the Gandhi assassination case. So there can be arguments made that, he was the brain behind Gandhi's assassination. There may be arguments that he was not involved there. But our simple argument is, let's have a conversation. And it's a good conversation to have, I think.
So,
and
Another question.
Let me talk about the book by Vaibhav sir. Two instances I would like to point out. One is about Savarkar as a champion. And he was mentioning the three Hindus like the Rajendra Lahiri and all those things, but he failed to, you mentioned, to take your exact word, he failed to name check Ashrafullah Khan. Can't that be, maybe for you that could be an apology for Savarkar, but taken from a different standpoint, it could be showing a kind of a communal aspect of him, where he was actually masking the Muslims, which is actually happening even now. One more thing. Yeah. You extended to say that even the people who were in the Kakori case, they had also written the petition. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Bless their soul, but they were hanged. But Savarkar, he got released. Yeah. That's the difference. That's a major difference. Yeah. And if we take up the further of his life, we find that he stick to his word, and he was not part of any movement that was there, but he kept his word to the British government. And one more name. One more. Just one more name to Vikram sir. It's about the usual name that comes up with Savarkar is the name of Chitragupta and his book, The Life of Barrister Savarkar. So if you could talk about that also, it would be great.
Yeah. Firstly, I'm grateful to you for having read my book. Like you correctly said, let me get to the Ashfaqullah Khan bit first. Like you correctly said, I have stated in my book that he did not mention Ashfaqullah Khan in that thing. I don't see how you see me as an apologist because of that, because actually I am pointing out that he is not named a Muslim as a martyr. Okay. Yeah, so that he failed to name check Ashfaqullah Khan, which is a way of saying he is not mentioned Ashfaqullah Khan. So actually what I am saying is he has not mentioned him because he is a Muslim.
What he's saying is what you're saying.
Exactly. So, no, because he is interpreting it as an apology, which it isn't. Second, your point about Dalits, which is that, wasn't it for Hindu consolidation? Of course, if you look at my book and my chapter on the caste, the anti-caste fight, where I talk about Savarkar's anti-caste ideas and Ambedkar's anti-caste ideas. I have stated very clearly that there is a difference. They both want to eliminate caste, but Savarkar has two reasons for eliminating caste. First, of course, he does not believe in inequality and all that. He says they should not be looked at as subhuman, which is perhaps Agarkar's legacy coming down to him, and Shahu Maharaj's legacy. At the same time, because he sees it as an obstacle to Hindu unity and consolidation. I have specifically said this. Ambedkar has absolutely no interest in Hindu unity. I have specifically said that also. So though they are both anti-caste reformers in the real sense of the term, Savarkar goes in one direction of Hindu consolidation and Ambedkar goes in another direction of rejecting Hinduism. When he says in 1935 that I have been born a Hindu, but I will not die a Hindu. So, my friend, I have stated this in clear terms there. And there was a third thing you mentioned, right? Kakori case. Yeah, so they were hanged and this guy was not hanged. But, when you are writing your mercy petitions, my simple point is this. Forget about strategy. This was a strategy to get out. That is his theory. Okay, if you believe in him, you may reject his theory. My simple point is this, that a testament given under conditions of torture cannot be seen as the genuine testament of a prisoner. That's my simple point.
You also made one more point about Savarkar not joining anything after he was released. Their books talk about the conditions that were placed on his release. He was not supposed to go out of Ratnagiri district. He had to take special permission to go for something in Bombay, a wedding or a funeral or something. So he wasn't permitted. But you're right, true, but he had just come out of prison. So that's the context in which they speak, the Chitragupta thing.
Yeah, so before that, in terms of not doing anything, one, of course, logic just, dictates that if you're my collaborator and, you're working in tandem with me, why would I put you under surveillance and house arrest for the longest period of time? So the conditions that were put on him for release was 5 years. You're going to abstain from politics and you're going to be confined to Ratnagiri. Even when plague hits there, he's not allowed to go. Now, by then, if you have turned into my collaborator, I would actually reduce this term from 5 years to 3 years. Instead, it is increased from 5 to 13. What was initially 5. So that clearly shows that even after that, the British somewhere did not trust him. So something was happening undercover, and most of the revolutionary activities, you don't even get documentation. So there are records of how even Subhash Chandra Bose actually met him before leaving India. And in this Azad Hind radio, an address in 1945, he clearly mentions, and Rash Bihari Bose in 1939, he writes a paper in Japanese called Dai Ajia Shugi, in which he calls Savarkar as the rising leader of New India. And this man is the founder of the INA. And so what was Netaji's address, where he says that while most of the congressmen are deriding the Indian soldiers who are entering the British Indian Army as mercenaries, it's only him who has understood that he's enlisting a lot of youngsters into the army. And the thing that I mentioned, and they are defecting and coming into the INA, and that is how we are swelling our ranks. So indirectly, was he helping these people? that is something which we'll need to investigate. Now, this whole Chitragupta thing, this book was written in 1926 under a pseudonym, and for the longest time, as long as Savarkar was born, the unwritten understanding of everyone, the book was also published from Madras, so was that this was actually penned by Rajagopalachari, with whom the family had very close links, and Rajaji in many letters actually has very laudatory things to say about him. So for the longest period of time, it was understood that Rajaji was the author of that book. It is only in the 1980 or 85 edition, I'm not sure, where there is this insinuation that is put that the author is actually Savarkar himself, who's writing laudatory terms about himself in his book. So without any corroboration, any evidence, because for the longest period of time when someone is writing it under the nom de plume, as you assume that's the author, we really don't know what the truth of that matter is. But the book continued to be published from Madras, and old-timers do think still that it was Rajaji who wrote it.
Okay, we are running out of time and getting multiple people on two sides telling me to stop. One quick thing in Malayalam, ഇതിന്റെ ഉദ്ദേശം നമ്മളെയൊക്കെ സാവർക്കറൈറ്റ്സ് ആക്കാനല്ല, പക്ഷെ അതിനെ ഫൈറ്റ് ചെയ്യണമെങ്കിലും അതിന്റെ facts of the matter അറിഞ്ഞിരിക്കണം. That's the only way you can answer it properly. And if you read the footnotes in the book, you'll see the source material is extremely short. Very quick, and then they can reply very quick.
I respect your comment being saying that okay, a conversation should be made, but sir, the conversation has a small problem that the entire conversation was made supporting and justifying a context for the Savarkar and never being on the okay, let's I'll give a small point. We were like saying he entered the Andaman as a revolutionary, but during that time, no, not a single mention was done like on your conversations where there itself like he turned to a Hindustic person like and was against other religious the prisoners over there. Well, whatever he did against his comments on his book itself on the Bang and the other Azan, every single thing over there, the entire conversation here and done on the land of Kerala over here, we find an agenda, we understand an agenda, or like we sense an agenda where an entire thing is be done to justify the Savarkar and a context being set to give a correctness or a clean sheet for the mercy petition done for Svarkar, which will never be accepted. Sorry.
The job is to not sit and accept on the basis of subsequent political ideology. The job is to look at the record. Do you think I'm a Savarkarite by any stretch? But the thing is, the way they've made their case, look at the footnotes, look at the source material, British archival records, writings of contemporaries, you place all these in context and you discover that there are let me finish. You got your chance, now let me finish. You get a man in different phases, in different contexts. As you said, the man who was the revolutionary was not the man in the prison. The man who came out of prison was not the man who created Hindutva. This platform wasn't about legitimizing his views. It was about understanding what led to those views. And we need to do that with a certain dispassionate energy. We need to do that by stepping back an inch. If you want to fight something, you need to know what you're fighting. You need to know the mind of the man who made that ideology that you want to stand up and fight, right? What happened inside that man? What was his own self-image? What was his own narrative? That needs to be investigated. Which is why, not even like having a conversation is a bad thing. The idea is to see both men here have written these books on Savarkar. It is not a worthless enterprise to try and understand where they're coming from, what they've uncovered, what the archives have spoken to them about, and trying to then see how we're going to respond to that. So you're welcome to do a rejoinder, but place these facts on the record and then accordingly construct your own rejoinder.
Manu, if I may add, it was made clear in unambiguous terms by both of us that Savarkar undergoes a radical ideological transformation at Kalapani when he encounters things like forced conversions. The Bang is something you mentioned. If we were to get into excruciating detail, then we would have to really speak for a very long period. So we have touched upon that thing. Of course, the transformation happens in cellular jail. There's no doubt about it. So.